as Christians, we tend to not do a very good job talking about tragedy. Tragedy is the kind of story that starts off well for a character and ends in disaster. And we don't like to talk about tragedy. And there are reasons for that, but what it often ends up is just our lives and our understanding of our faith become saturated with stories about blessing and promises and sentimentalisms and cliches because they don't have any depth to them. And as a pastor, I really see two problems with that. I'm a pastor of a wonderful church. I love my people, and they have given me the gift of being able to see up close the problems with this mentality. The first problem is most of us, we don't live in a world that is untouched with tragedy. The people that I pastor, the people that I deal with, they deal with the elements of tragedy all the time in 1,000 different ways. They deal with God's they deal with the fall. They deal with people that have been hurt and broken. That the fall has sunk its little roots and tendrils down and is sucking the nutrients out of their souls. They see that. Most of us, we don't live. We live in a world where people hurt us, where we hurt others, where people hide things from us, where we hide things from others, where people betray us, we betray others. Most of the people that I know, we live in a world where people are racked with guilt. And so this approach to the Christian life that doesn't have any depth doesn't do any good. It's not realistic. But the second problem that I see with that is if we never take the time to talk about sin, if we never take the time to talk about darkness, we never take the time to talk about guilt, then we never take the time to talk about salvation. We never take time to talk about light. We never take the time to talk about grace. See, the reality is that when we come to understand sin better, we understand salvation so much better. When we understand guilt more, we understand God's grace better. See, the point of talking about sin and darkness and evil is because it puts a spotlight on the grace of our God and Jesus Christ. And thankfully, even though sometimes we are not always very good at it, this book that we believe in, the Bible, this book is filled with songs and stories and laments and epics about people just like you and me, people who lived in a broken world, people who friends hurt, people that they trusted hurts them, and they have to live with the ramifications of their sin. And yet in the midst of all of that brokenness, God brings forth beauty, and God gives hope in the midst of hopelessness and shows his faith to a faithless people, and he gives grace to a guilty person. And one of the stories in this book is the story of Achan in the Old Testament. And Achan is this interesting story because of all these different reasons. And we see as the story goes on and on about Achan, his sin becomes more and more evident. And we see the effects of it in darker and darker ways. And we get to the end, and it's like suddenly we realize that God had grace there all along. And that the point of bringing up the story about Achan, about his terrible deed that he did, was to showcase just how good and loving and gracious and merciful God can be. The story of Achan is our story. The only difference is that he refused to take the grace of God that God had given him. And the question is, will we do the same? I wrote this book about the story of Achan because I wanted us to see just how complex and multi-layered and difficult it is to deal with sin. But if we deal with sin, there is salvation on the other side. If we deal with guilt, there's grace on the other side. If we deal with darkness, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I wrote this book for people to understand sin better, but more importantly, to understand salvation better. For people to understand brokenness so that they might understand beauty. For people to understand guilt so they might understand grace. I wrote this book about Achan's life just to show us how good God is to those who have no good in them at all. This book is for people like you and me who love God's church and love God and want to serve him, but so often we let him down. And yet God is so good to us. If that is you, this book is for you.